She's a highly regarded teacher, and she was awarded Western's Excellence in Teaching recently. Yeah. Herring are critical members of the Salish sea food web, since they are one of the most important sources of food for many larger fish and mammals. I think all of us are at least fully aware of the connection through the food chain to the beloved orca whales. Her presentation is...
I'm really happy to be here. It's always great. It's always great to get a chance to share some of the things that I really care about with other people who care about these things too. So let's get started. So first, I have to acknowledge all of the people who've helped in some of the work that I'm talking about today. I'm not going to spend that much time talking about the work that goes on in my lab, but still. Christina, Tyler, and Kale are my three most recent graduate students who've done boots in the mud type work, which I think is pretty great. We also are really highly ranked in terms of sending students for Fulbright scholarships and to the Peace Corps. I'm a return Peace Corps volunteer myself, so I really appreciate that about Western, that our students are people who want to go out there and do something good. So. We also have a new marine science major that we're starting up at Western. You may be surprised to know we didn't have one before. We have a lot of marine scientists. We did not have a major until now, so we're really excited about bringing on even more people and more students to study the oceans. Okay, so ocean acidification. So we're going to talk about, what is it, why should we care about, what can we do about it, and we're thinking about that all in the context of the Salish Sea, about our local waters here. So before we get started, let me do a quick poll of you all. So if you know a lot about ocean acidification, I want your hand like up here. And if you're like, I don't know, I heard a few things kind of here, like, I don't know anything about ocean acidification. Okay, all right, we've got a range, which is typical. So we'll go over some of the basics, but I won't dwell on it too long. Even though I'm a chemist, I'm not going to do any chemical equations, so you can ask me about them later if you want. I'll write them somewhere for you. All right, so 20 trillion pounds of CO2 are added to the ocean by fossil fuel burning every year. But, I mean, that's just like a really big number, right? I mean, it's just like a 2 with a bunch of zeros. It's really hard to contextualize that, so here's my analogy that I use for it. That's the equivalent of 1 bowling ball per person per day for everyone on Earth. And I'm sure you all are really virtuous in terms of your carbon footprint, but we're Americans, and so that means you're still at least 2 bowling balls, maybe 3 or 4. So you can imagine yourself, going down to the marina in the morning with your bowling ball every day, heaving it in, right? The ocean is big, but that's a lot of carbon, and it's making a difference. So what happens when you add CO2 to the ocean? So we're about doubling the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, which means we're doubling the amount that's in equilibrium with it in the ocean. There's a series of equations that are all in equilibrium with each other. So the result of that is that bicarbonate, which you're familiar with as baking soda, goes up, and carbonate, which you may be familiar with as Alka-Seltzer, goes down. So the result of that is that things that use CO2 and bicarbonate, like plants and algae, for instance, at first blush are happy, right? They've got more of their raw material for doing photosynthesis and growing. Things that make shells, which are made out of calcium carbonate, so carbonate is the raw material for that, have problems, because if there's less carbonate, it's harder to make a shell. So those are the kind of 2 ends of the seesaw of the simple way of thinking about the effects of these changes in the chemistry. But there's a whole bunch of organisms in between. I put my little herring up there that, we don't know. It's unclear what the effects are going to be. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail as we go forward here, making the pH go down. So let's see, there we go. So that's right, more acidic as lower pH. Yes, absolutely.
I've always been so curious about this when I heard that the ocean was at 8 and 7 is neutral and below 7 is acidic, so why do we call it acidification if it's still basic? I mean, I know it's becoming more towards acid, but it's not acid.
Yeah, so the question is, why do we call it acidification if the ocean is not actually acidic or even going to be acidic anytime soon? The analogy that I use for this is, think about, you can see that it's gone up and down over time in the last 400,000 years. And if you're a climate, that's resulted in a 30% increase since the start of the industrial. It's a pteropod. It's a mollusk. It's a pteropod. Getting like 90% mortality. And they're trying to figure out what was going on. At first they thought maybe it was. So in the daytime, there's a lot of photosynthesis going on. Second was doing a bit of a problem when there's high CO2 in the water. So let's look at the other. If you have more CO2 in the water, what effect does that have on how fast? So if you've got oysters, clams, and scallops, those are things that have likely Northeast Pacific. So many of them are species that are around here, although there's not as much carbonate in the water. Others are things that are not harvested. So they don't have the size of nutrients. So we've got algal and the local problem of runoff, and they're both combined. So the water that's coming in from the ocean into the Salish Sea, getting more acidic over time, maybe turning out neutral. And then I've got a question mark over here. So we've got some being eaten by some zooplankton. We've got a little copepod there, it's eating the diatoms, which is then eaten by some small fish, could be a herring, which is then eaten by a big predatory fish. So if you think of this sort of rising tide idea, you might enter a food web that goes over here to different types of zooplankton, and then up to cnidarians or jellyfish. So there's a possibility that if you change the conditions, the types of phytoplankton long ago that seem to indicate that also in the South Sound, a little different from that. And I think it's a really important point to think about in terms of ocean acidification, that even if it could be changing. And then we've got forage fish in the middle here, of which herring is, of course, a very important example. And I had to add an orca off to the side here because there wasn't one on this figure, but it's our favorite link in the food web having to do with herring. So Pacific herring are really important. Forage fish in general are really important as this link in the ocean food web. So around here in the Salish Sea, there are 18 known Pacific herring stocks. And my student Christina did a study on the cherry point population, which is in red at the top there, and big effect on them. Most of the studies have been done on Atlantic herring, but they're very closely related to Pacific herring. Temperature, we know, is a problem for them. If it gets too warm, bad things happen, which we'll talk about in a minute. And we also want to know, well, what happens if you change PCO10? These ones are deformed. This sort of curl that they have means they won't be able to swim. So that's a non-successful hatching there. So hatching success. So she looked at all those things and found that CO2 and temperature. So over here is the mortality. So how many of them died? And then we've got for herring larvae. So, I'm going to turn my herring larvae upside down there. So this could be bad, right? That if we have this link here that protection because of that. The other piece of this story is that that's not the end of their life, right? I mean, it's a tough world out there for herring larvae. And there's a lot of mortality after they hatch and as they're trying to grow. And there's been other studies on Atlantic herring that have actually shown that the effect of higher CO2 on the plankton is beneficial. So we're going to stay with our red box around our carbon, calcium carbonate with shell species, and we're going to stay with our question mark here for the plankton capacity for some adaptation. So basically you put it all together, and the magic 8-ball says, reply hazy, try again later. Not easily predictable. And that local action can influence our local waters. So I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about that, about carbon footprint. So I want to do a little exercise here for a minute. And you don't necessarily all have these your ideas. What can everybody do? Yeah.
Well, in our case, we have solar.
Yeah. Okay.
And so it reduces our dependence on electricity.
Absolutely. So install solar, rooftop solar, on your house or your garage. Yeah.
I think the number one thing is energy efficiency.
And the biggest one, nobody ever says this one, have one fewer child. And the first time I saw this, or as this came up in conversation with somebody, who'd be like, that this is what, somebody told me that they were gonna not have children because of the carbon impact. And I was really taken aback by that, because it felt like that is a really, really person can actually do. Live car free, so we talked about that. There's several different car ones in here. So car free is the biggest one. Let me just talk about the scale here. This is savings in tons per year. LEDs, like that's good too. I mean, every little bit helps. But the person who's like, I have bought all my energy efficient light bulbs and now I'm off to Hawaii. That's for one person. Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot. So these are the things we should be doing. This is one of my favorite cartoons, and the type might be a little small, so I'll read it. It says, day 44, still stranded with nothing but flat, empty water as far as the eye can see. So we've got a little person on a desert island there with all of this amazing stuff going on under the water, but they can't see it. And I think it's just really evocative of the reality of how we relate to the ocean. There is a lot going on beneath the surface, but we're land animals, and it's difficult for us to see under the surface. We're just getting started with it. We have a lot to learn, and I think that caution about changing the world really drastically would probably be a good place to start from, because we don't know what the effects are going to be. So, we have some time for questions. Yes? Doing, yeah.
I've always wondered about Shannon Point. Do you folks, how many folks are there working these science issues, and do you have open houses?
We do have open houses at Shannon Point. So how many people are there? There are, I want to say 5 or 6 kind of scientists who are based there, and then there are people like me who.
But they said in some places, other places are declining too. But overall, our herring increasing.
You mean like in the Salish Sea?
In the Salish Sea.
I don't think so. I think there have been, like I said, there are 18 different stocks, and there are about 3 kind of genetically distinct groupings within that. And they all spawn drastic impacts from ocean acidification. So studies in the Great Barrier Reef have shown that the rate at which it's growing is already declining. It's declined by about 25%. So they're not building as much coral as it has in the past. There have been 5 or 6 times in the Earth's history when the oceans have become pretty acidic from natural variability. And during those times, coral reefs have pretty much been wiped out. There are generally like a few different spots around the world where there's these areas of refuge and they survive, and then they kind of recolonize out from there. And this is something that happens on the scale of millions of years. So people are looking at this now in terms of coral reefs, and
sometimes I say that if you want to see the Great Barrier Reef, you better go now, but don't go because it's a lot of carbon to get there on an airplane. Yeah, it's looking pretty grim for coral reefs. There are areas that they've found that have naturally high levels of CO2, and the coral that grows there seems to be resilient. And so they're thinking about different things that they could do, like, well, what if we take the genes from these ones and genetically modify the coral? Sea turtles like to eat jellyfish. There's been various different ideas of what could be done with jellyfish. In some other cultures, people eat jellyfish. It might be a hard sell to get Americans to start eating them. I saw one product that was actually a diaper that was made out of jellyfish. That happened in other places. There are these jellyfish blooms, and then people are like, "Oh God, jellyfish are taking over." So I would take anything that you see about overabundance of